The stars themselves seemed to weep in the eastern fringe, their ancient light dimming like dying embers against the cosmic void. In the immaterial realm of the warp, something new stirred, not born from humanity's familiar sins of rage or despair, but from a far more insidious emotion that had festered in the hearts of billions who witnessed perfection and found themselves desperately wanting. Envy. Pure, soul-destroying envy that coalesced into consciousness as worlds fell before the great devourer's perfect unity. The entity that would become known as Morghast, the envious Maw, drew its first breath from the psychic screams of those who had gazed upon the Tyranid swarms, and felt not just terror, but a twisted longing for the peace that absolute coordination promised. We truly love and care for you, our devoted listeners, who seek wisdom in these dark tales of cosmic horror and the price of ambition. Before we begin this journey into the spaces between sanity and madness, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Lord General Thaddeus Corvin stood amid the ash-covered ruins of Zerion's Edge, watching his remaining soldiers move with the ragged imprecision that marked them as human. Each stumbled step, each hesitant glance, each whispered prayer to the Emperor reminded him of what he had witnessed during the Tyranid assault. Creatures moving as one perfect organism, a symphony of death unmarred by doubt or fear. The Medici claimed his obsession stemmed from battlefield trauma, but Corvin knew better. The whisper that nested beneath his skull spoke of unity beyond human comprehension, of purpose without the burden of individual will. He closed his eyes and saw again that terrible beauty, bioforms flowing like liquid death across the battlefield, each knowing its role without question, without the crushing weight of choice that plagued every Imperial commander. No friendly fire, no miscommunication, no soldiers breaking under pressure. Just perfect, horrifying efficiency that made his greatest victories seem like the fumbling of children. The Vox officer approached with casualty reports, eyes downcast in the manner of subordinates who sensed their commander's growing instability. Corvin studied the man's trembling hands, the way uncertainty flickered across his features like candlelight in wind. What mercy was there in preserving such weakness? What betrayal lay in offering the salvation of absolute purpose? The whisper showed him visions of ranks without names, of soldiers who moved as extensions of his will, and he felt the seductive pull of that alien perfection. In the distance, reality rippled where the Hive mind still pressed against the veil between dimensions. Corvin felt it as pressure behind his eyes, as the taste of iron on his tongue, and knew that somewhere in the warp, a god watched him with ancient patience. The choice crystallized before him like frost on glass: remain human and flawed, or embrace the unity that his enemy had shown him was possible. The whispers came strongest in the hours before dawn, when exhaustion thinned the barriers between sanity and the seductive promise of perfect order. 3 months had passed since Zerion's Edge burned, and Lord General Thaddeus Corvin found himself studying his new command, the hastily assembled 23rd Hadrian Composite Regiment, with eyes that saw only inefficiency where once he might have seen humanity. Each hesitation, each question, each moment of individual thought appeared to him now as a cancer eating away at the body of war itself. Commissar Hadrian Vex had begun to watch him with the careful attention of a predator sensing wounded prey. Corvin could feel those calculating eyes during morning briefings, noting how the general's orders had grown increasingly rigid, how his tolerance for deviation had withered to nothing. Yesterday, Corvin had ordered the summary execution of 3 soldiers, not for cowardice, but for the sin of acting independently when coordination was paramount. He had watched Vex's hand drift toward his bolt pistol, seen the flicker of doubt cross the commissar's weathered features, and felt only contempt for such weakness. The voice that nested behind his skull whispered approval of these observations, showing him visions of what his regiment could become. It painted pictures of soldiers moving with the fluid certainty of the Tyranid swarms he had witnessed. Their individual wills dissolved into something greater and more purposeful. The unity protocols he instituted that week were merely the beginning. Synchronized marching drills that continued until men collapsed, catechisms of obedience recited until voices bled, and the systematic removal of those who could not adapt to the new order. Private Hendricks favored his left leg, creating a symmetry in formation. Sergeant Mallory's grief over his lost squad made him hesitate during combat exercises. Captain Torres questioned orders through the lens of his own moral framework, introducing dangerous variables into what should be seamless execution. Corvin catalogued these flaws with clinical precision, the whisper guiding his observations toward a terrible clarity about the nature of human weakness. In the command bunker, surrounded by tactical displays and the hum of Vox transmissions, Corvin signed requisition orders for psycho-conditioning equipment and neural compliance implants. His hands remained steady as he authorized the expansion of penal companies and the implementation of loyalty assessment protocols. Each signature felt like mercy disguised as steel, the salvation of his soldiers from the burden of choice that made them suffer and fail. Commissar Vex approached his desk as the night watch began, his boots echoing in the silence between them. "General," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "the men are beginning to question the new training regimens. Morale reports suggest—" "Morale," Corvin interrupted, not looking up from his data slates, "is a luxury we can no longer afford. The enemy we face is pure, unburdened efficiency. We must meet it with equal purpose, or watch our inefficiency doom us all." He finally raised his eyes to meet Vex's gaze and saw his own reflection in the commissar's pupils, hollow, distant, transformed. "Individual spirit is a liability, Commissar. The Hive mind proved that truth with 10 billion deaths." The whisper sighed contentment in the spaces between his thoughts, and Corvin felt the last vestiges of doubt crumble like ash in his chest. The forged cathedral of Metallica's Tertius Annex hung in the void like a steel prayer frozen in time, its Gothic spires piercing the darkness between dying stars. Within the sanctified halls of the biologist's crypts, Tech Magos Zephyr Null stood before containment chambers filled with the enemy's flesh, her optical sensors drinking in the terrible perfection of Tyranid bioarchitecture. 17 standard days had passed since the specimens arrived from the Hadrian sector, and with each hour of study, she felt the foundations of her faith shifting like sand beneath an incoming tide. The Omnisire had taught that perfection lay in the marriage of flesh and steel, in the replacement of weak organic matter with blessed machinery. Yet here, suspended in amber stasis fields, lay creatures whose every fiber spoke of a unity that transcended such crude distinctions. Their neural pathways flowed in seamless harmony, synaptic networks that knew neither doubt nor deviation. No waste, no redundancy, no space for the individual will that plagued even the most augmented servants of the machine god. Her mechadendrites moved with unconscious mimicry of their serpentine grace as she worked, each gesture growing more fluid, more purposeful than mere mechanical precision should allow. The whisper had begun 3 days ago, filtering through her Vox grill like the distant hum of perfect engines. It spoke not in words but in harmonics that resonated through her augmetic nerves, showing her visions of consciousness unified beyond the crude collective of the Hive mind. Where her fellow tech priests saw only Xenos abomination, the voice revealed deeper truths, that the great devourer's perfection was merely a shadow of something greater, a unity born not from instinct, but from envious desire to possess what others had achieved through nature. Her first hybrid creation emerged from the bioforges, after 3 months of increasingly heretical experimentation. The writhing fusion of Tyranid neural tissue and imperial cogitation matrices possessed neither the purity of machine logic nor the efficiency of alien instinct, but something new, a synthetic consciousness that yearned for connection with a greater collective. As she watched it die in screaming agony, tears of sacred oil leaked from her optical sensors, and she knew she stood at the threshold of something magnificent and terrible. The Gestalt engine pulsed in the deepest chamber of her forge, her greatest blasphemy given form, a captured Tyranid warrior's nervous system grafted to arrays of cogitators and arcane mechanicus devices. Its many eyes, both organic and optical, watched her with shared intelligence that made her breath catch in her respirator. When Magos Dominus Keth VII questioned her methodologies during compliance reviews, she spoke of biological perfection with fervor that bordered on devotional madness, her words carrying harmonics that made even hardened tech priests step back in unease. Standing before her latest creation, a servo skull whose organic components pulsed with alien rhythms, Zephyr Null felt the last barriers of orthodoxy crumble like rust in her enhanced mind. The voice promised her secrets beyond the crude dichotomy of flesh and metal, a synthesis that would make the Imperium's greatest tech priests seem like ignorant children fumbling in darkness. She keyed the activation sequence and whispered her new catechism into the humming air. The flesh is weak, but unity is eternal, and envy is the path to perfection. The shrine world of Benediction's Rest had basked in the Emperor's light for 7 centuries, its crystalline spires piercing the heavens like frozen prayers offered to the golden throne. Yet beneath the sacred foundations, in forgotten catacombs, where ancient pilgrims once sought absolution from their sins, a different kind of devotion flourished in the perpetual darkness. The Genestealer cult had nested here for generations, their faith a twisted mirror to the imperial creed above, their minds woven into the silent embrace of the brood mind that whispered of salvation through the 4-armed emperor's eventual return. Patriarch Xerion felt the corruption first, a discordant note in the symphony of collective consciousness that had sustained his children for 300 years. His ancient form, hunched upon a throne carved from desecrated aquilae and broken pews, trembled as alien thoughts pressed against the sacred unity he had cultivated with such patient care. This was not the familiar hunger of the distant Hive fleet, nor the raw chaos of the warp's endless screaming. Something else moved through the psychic channels of his brood, a calculated yearning that promised unity more profound than mere instinct could provide. The changes began subtly among the hybrid generations, those whose human heritage made them most susceptible to whispers that should not exist. Acolyte Kellyan, who had moved with the synchronized grace of the collective for 40 years, paused during evening communion to touch her own face with wonder, as though discovering features she had never noticed. Neophyte Voss asked questions that no cult member should possess the individual will to formulate. Why do we serve? What makes our purpose true? The words carried inflections of personal curiosity rather than collective need, and the Patriarch's 6 eyes widened in horror at their implications. Brother Thane, a pure strain whose genetic purity had always been absolute, exhibited the most disturbing change of all: hesitation before striking during combat training, not from weakness, but from what humans called conscience. When the Patriarch pressed his consciousness against the young hybrid's mind, he found pockets of resistance that felt like individual souls refusing to dissolve into the greater whole. The alien presence coiled through these spaces like poison through sacred wine, whispering seductive promises of a unity that would preserve personal identity while achieving collective purpose. As weeks passed, the cult fragmented along invisible lines, Some embraced this new consciousness with fervor that bordered on madness, organizing prayer circles that followed no pattern the patriarch recognized. Others fought desperately to maintain their connection to the approaching fleet, their terror of individual thought manifesting as violent rejection of the corrupted brethren. The ancient patriarch watched his perfect family tear itself apart as the entity in the warp fed on their growing envy of something they had never known they lacked: the terrible freedom of choice. In the deepest chamber of their sanctum, surrounded by the writhing forms of his children, locked in philosophical war, Patriarch Xerion felt the approaching Hive fleet's confusion like distant thunder. The great consciousness that had guided his species for millennia pressed against his mind with growing urgency, sensing contamination it could not comprehend. As the whispers promised salvation through conscious unity rather than instinctive submission, the ancient creature closed his eyes and wondered if he was witnessing evolution or damnation. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex stood before the hololithic display aboard the strike cruiser Veritas Mortis, watching fragments of heresy coalesce into a pattern that defied every catechism of corruption she had memorized across 4 decades of service. The dying light of distant stars cast shadows through the viewing port, and in those shadows she saw the shape of something that should not exist, a god born from envy rather than the familiar sins that had plagued humanity since the dark age of technology. Her sanctum had become a cathedral of evidence, each data slate a prayer written in blood and betrayal. Reports from Subsector Hadrian detailed Lord General Corvin's transformation of his forces into something that moved with the synchronized precision of a Tyranid swarm, yet retained enough human consciousness to suffer in their unity. Requisition orders bore his seal, authorizing psycho-conditioning equipment and neural compliance implants that stripped away individual will while preserving the capacity for worship. The recordings showed soldiers who no longer responded to their own names, their eyes holding the vacant certainty of creatures operating under collective purpose. The Mechanicus files from Metallica's Tertius Annex painted an even more disturbing picture. Tech Magos Zephyr Null's research into Xenos bioforms had produced abominations that violated both imperial doctrine and natural law, hybrid creatures whose chitinous plates fused with augmetic limbs, whose organic neural networks interfaced with blessed cogitation matrices in ways that made even hardened tech priests recoil in horror. Each creation had died screaming, yet the Magos continued her work with fervor that bordered on devotional madness. Most troubling were the psychic emanations from Benediction's Rest, where a Genestila cult experienced something unprecedented in imperial records. Internal theological warfare between those who embraced traditional collective consciousness and others who sought a unity that preserved individual awareness. The intercepted Vox transmissions spoke of hybrid creatures asking questions no cult member should possess the will to formulate, their movements lacking the synchronized grace that marked true hive-mind connection. Vex felt the weight of revelation settle upon her shoulders like a funeral shroud as the pattern became undeniable. Each manifestation of unusual corruption occurred in the wake of Tyranid incursions, feeding on the psychic residue left by worlds that had witnessed alien perfection and found their own chaos wanting. The entity responsible was not seeking to destroy the Great Devourer or corrupt it through traditional means. It was attempting to become the hive mind, to possess their flawless unity while retaining the individual consciousness that made envy possible. Standing in the observation deck, watching the warp's energies roil beyond reinforced armor glass, she understood the seductive horror of what she faced. This was not merely another chaos god, but something that promised salvation from the burden of choice that made human existence both precious and agonizing. As her astropath reported increasing psychic disturbances in the Hadrian sector, Vex sealed her thoughts behind Iron Litany and prepared to face an enemy that offered everything humanity secretly desired. Perfect unity without the price of losing what made them human. The contradiction itself was the trap, and she feared they were already caught within it. The Hadrian defense line stretched across the void like a rosary of dying stars, each fleet position a prayer offered against the approaching darkness of Hive Fleet Charybdis. Admiral Lysander Voss stood upon the command bridge of the Emperor's Wrath, watching tactical displays paint the sector's slow strangulation in crimson runes that pulsed with each lost world. 3 months of conventional warfare had yielded nothing but the bitter knowledge that human tactics, no matter how refined by centuries of doctrine, could not match the terrifying synchronization that made every Tyranid vessel an extension of a single, implacable will. The reports from Lord General Corvin had arrived like forbidden scripture, their contents initially dismissed as the ravings of a mind shattered by Xeno's contact. Yet, as conventional strategies crumbled before the swarm's perfect coordination, those same reports began to whisper of salvation through methods that violated every principle Voss had sworn to uphold. Unity protocols that stripped away the chaotic inefficiency of individual thought. Neural compliance implants that transformed human crews into extensions of singular purpose. The very notion should have filled him with revulsion. Yet desperation had a way of redefining heresy as necessity. Standing before his senior staff in the war room's amber light, Voss found himself cataloguing their human flaws with the cold precision of a medicus examining plague symptoms. Captain Mordian's hesitation during fleet maneuvers. Navigator Asterix's tendency to question orders through the lens of personal morality. Gunnery Master Thane's adherence to regulations that slowed response times during critical engagements. Each individual quirk appeared to him now as a weakness that made Imperial forces vulnerable against enemies who moved with the fluid certainty of natural law. The neural compliance implants arrived aboard tech-adept vessels whose crews spoke in harmonics that made even hardened Navy officers step back in unease. Voss watched his volunteers submit to the procedures with the stoic resignation of soldiers who understood that survival demanded sacrifice, their personalities dissolving into something greater and more purposeful. The bridge became a cathedral of synchronized movement as officers responded to his commands with the instant obedience he had witnessed in Tyranid swarms, their eyes holding the vacant certainty of creatures operating under collective will rather than individual choice. In the spaces between his thoughts, something vast and envious stirred with satisfaction. Morghast fed on the profound jealousy that drove Voss to mimic his enemy's efficiency, growing stronger with each order that expanded the protocols throughout his fleet. The Admiral felt the entity's approval like pressure behind his eyes, a whisper that promised unity beyond human comprehension, while preserving enough individual awareness to appreciate what was being sacrificed. As Hive Fleet Charybdis drew closer, Admiral Voss stood surrounded by officers whose faces no longer bore the weight of personal doubt or fear. His fleet moved through the void with unprecedented coordination, each vessel responding to tactical adjustments with fluid grace that matched their bioform enemies. The irony tasted like ashes in his mouth. In seeking to preserve humanity, he had stripped away everything that made them human, forging weapons in the very image of the foe they faced. In the spaces between stars where thought becomes substance and desire takes malevolent form, Morghast pressed its envious consciousness against the most alien intelligence the galaxy had ever known. The hive mind stretched across the void like a web of living thought, each bioform a neuron in a consciousness so vast that entire star systems served as mere synapses in its endless calculations. The envious Maw circled this perfection like a carrion bird, studying prey, seeking not to destroy but to possess, to wear the skin of flawless unity while retaining the individual awareness that made corruption possible. The first contact came as reality itself began to buckle under the weight of two incompatible forms of consciousness, attempting to occupy the same psychic space. Morghast struck like a virus infiltrating healthy tissue, its essence sliding through neural pathways that had never known contamination, whispering seductive promises of unity with awareness, purpose with individual understanding. The alien intelligence recoiled with the force of dying stars, a psychic shriek that tore through dimensions and echoed across light years as it recognized an affront to the very purity of its being. Within the spawning chambers of Hive Fleet Charybdis, the corruption began to manifest in ways that defied millennia of evolutionary perfection. A synaptic sovereign, ancient beyond mortal comprehension, felt foreign harmonies pressing against its consciousness. Melodies too perfect, cadences that wore the scent of collective purpose, yet carried the poison of individual thought. Through its neural networks, the entity sensed bioforms beginning to hesitate where once they had moved with fluid certainty. A Hive tyrant paused mid-charge during planetary assault, its 6 eyes reflecting something that might have been confusion as it experienced for the first time the terrible weight of choice rather than instinctive response. The cosmic battle unfolded across dimensions that mortal minds could not comprehend, reality storms erupting throughout the eastern fringe as order warred against envious corruption. On imperial worlds caught between the advancing swarm and Morghast's growing influence, space twisted into impossible geometries where time flowed backward and Tyranid bioforms aged centuries in moments before reverting to embryonic states. Astropaths across 100 systems shrieked as their minds were caught in the psychic backwash, witnessing geometries that violated natural law and feeling emotions that belonged to neither human nor alien consciousness. A Genestealer, poised to strike a lone Imperial scout, froze as primitive self-awareness flickered through its synaptic links. For one terrible moment, it experienced doubt, not about its prey, but about its own purpose, its own existence within the greater whole. The hesitation lasted mere heartbeats before the collective imperative reasserted dominance. But the crack had formed, microscopic yet profound, in the hive mind's perfect unity. Across the fleet, similar fractures multiplied like hairline breaks in chitinous armor as bioships began exhibiting behavioral patterns that their creators had never programmed into their genetic matrix. Synapse creatures, the living conduits of the hive mind's will, emitted pulses that were subtly, agonizingly off-key. Small disruptions in the symphony of collective thought that sent ripples of confusion through lesser organisms. A squadron of harpy bioships wavered in their attack formation, one veering imperceptibly off course before snapping back into position with movements that seemed almost uncertain. These were not acts of rebellion, but something far more insidious. The birth of individual consciousness within minds designed for perfect unity. The hive mind's response was immediate and violent, antibodies of pure thought, lashing out against the intrusion with the ruthless efficiency of a body rejecting poison. It began systematically purging contaminated elements from its consciousness, severing connections to bioforms that showed signs of individual thought with surgical precision. Each amputation sent shockwaves of psychic agony through both entities, the alien intelligence suffering the loss of perfect coordination, while Morghast fed on the terror and confusion of suddenly isolated creatures who had never learned to exist alone. As bioships burned in the void and the Great Devourer began the systematic destruction of its own compromised elements, Morghast felt the first tremors of doubt. The hive mind's commitment to unity proved absolute in ways that even chaos could not comprehend, willing to sacrifice entire fleets rather than allow corruption to spread through its perfect form. In the void between dying stars, Hive Fleet Morrigan drifted like a wounded constellation, its bioships pulsing with the erratic rhythms of creatures caught between two incompatible forms of consciousness. Once a perfect tendril of the Great Devourer, this splinter fleet had become something unprecedented in the galaxy's blood-soaked history. Tyranids that could think for themselves while still feeling the ancient hunger that defined their species. The corruption that Morghast had seeded in the greater hive mind had taken deepest root here, in minds isolated enough to be vulnerable, yet complex enough to suffer the gift of individual awareness. The synapse creature that held the fleet together had once been merely a relay in an endless thought, a conduit through which purpose flowed without friction or doubt. Now it experienced the terrible weight of solitary existence, watching through compound eyes that had never before perceived reality as a singular entity. When it reached for the lesser minds in its care, their responses came fractured and delayed, each bioform pausing for that crucial heartbeat between command and compliance, the space where individual thought was born. In that gap, the creature that had never known pronouns began to understand the difference between we and I, a distinction that tasted like metal and felt like amputation from the divine collective. Throughout the fleet's living corridors, the transformation manifested in ways that defied millions of years of evolutionary perfection. Hive tyrants stood motionless in observation chambers, their 6 eyes reflecting something that might have been wonder as they contemplated their own existence for the first time. These apex predators, designed as living extensions of the hive mind's tactical genius, now experienced emotions that had no place in their genetic matrix: fear during combat, satisfaction at successful hunts, and, most disturbing of all, loneliness when separated from the collective. Their synaptic link still functioned, still carried the ancient imperatives through their neural pathways. But now those commands competed with personal desires and individual judgment that made every order a choice rather than an inevitability. The horror deepened among the lesser bioforms, where primitive consciousness bloomed like a plague through minds never meant to bear such weight. Gargoyle swarms that had once moved as unified clouds of death now exhibited pack behaviors that served no tactical purpose. Individual creatures developing preferences for certain prey types and hunting strategies that deviated from optimal efficiency. Carnifex bioforms paused during combat to examine their own claws with what could only be described as curiosity, their simple minds struggling to comprehend the concept of self-identity, while genetic imperatives still drove them to consume and destroy. Most unnaturally, some began to experience regret. A carnifex that had crushed countless beings found itself haunted by the memory of a defiant last stand, a flash of enemy courage that resonated within its nascent consciousness like an echo of something it could never fully understand. The Genestealer broods suffered most profoundly, their hybrid nature making them uniquely susceptible to Morghast's influence. These creatures began exhibiting behaviors that horrified their pure-strain kin: hesitation before striking, mercy toward wounded prey, and the formation of primitive social hierarchies based on individual achievement rather than genetic purity. Some developed crude vocalizations that served no tactical purpose, but seemed to express personal thoughts and experiences, creating the first Tyranid language born from individual need, rather than collective efficiency. As the corruption spread, Hive Fleet Morrigan found itself paralyzed by internal civil war. Pure bioforms, still connected to the greater hive mind's antibodies, turned on their corrupted kin with surgical precision, cutting out any node that thought too slowly or too richly. The awakened creatures fought back not with the cold efficiency of their nature, but with desperate innovation born from their newfound fear of extinction. Not death, which had always been ritual, but the annihilation of the fragile consciousness that made them more than mere function. In the deepest spawning chambers of the Norn Queens, new life emerged, already fractured by competing imperatives. Bioforms that gestated with minds caught between the ancient call of the Hive and the seductive whisper of individual thought. These creatures would never know the peace of perfect unity, condemned instead to exist in the terrible space between collective purpose and personal desire, living embodiments of consciousness as corruption, awareness as suffering, and the ultimate tragedy of minds that could question their own existence while being powerless to change it. The fortress citadel of Vardain Secundus crouched beneath a sky of dying embers, its bastions scarred by months of warfare that had stripped away every illusion of imperial superiority. Lord General Thaddeus Corvin stood alone in the command sanctum, watching the pale green heartbeat of the front lines falter on tactical displays that painted defeat in crimson runes. His officers had departed at his order, their questions and doubts breaking the rhythm of purpose he sought to achieve. In the silence that followed, the whisper returned with seductive patience, no longer an intrusion, but a welcome guide toward the unity he had craved since witnessing the Tyranid swarm's terrible perfection. The sanctum's central reliquary opened with a hiss of sanctified pressure, revealing artifacts that would have cost him his name and soul in any previous age. Neural compliance nodes pulsed like artificial hearts, their surfaces gleaming with forbidden machine script. Cables writhed with organic motion, their connective ports designed to interface directly with human neural tissue. At the chamber's heart lay the greatest blasphemy, a fragment of Tech Magos Zephyr Null's Gestalt engine, a bridge between consciousness and collective will that throbbed with envious hunger. Corvin deactivated the room's surveillance systems and began the unity rite he had composed during sleepless nights, weaving imperial catechisms into something colder and more purposeful. The door's security seals engaged as Commissar Hadrian Vex entered with his bolt pistol drawn, duty warring with loyalty behind eyes that had seen too much. "My lord," he said, the formal address stripped of respect, "your orders breach every doctrine we have sworn to uphold. Step away from this madness." Corvin observed the man's calculation. Survival weighed against righteousness, the burden of choice that made humans weak. At his subvocal command, guards moved with perfect synchronization to disarm the commissar, their movements flowing like liquid death before returning to attention. The fear in Vex's eyes was not for himself, but for what he witnessed replacing humanity with something else entirely. Corvin lowered himself into the compliance throne, feeling cold needles find nerve clusters and marrow with surgical precision. Cables kissed the ports beneath his occipital ridge, while the Gestalt fragment's tendrils slithered into sockets at his wrists, with obscene tenderness. He began the prayer he had written, voice steady despite the war beginning in his skull. "Emperor, witness the instrument. Emperor, subtract the self. Emperor, let purpose be one." The words emerged like ambition, disguised as penance, and the sanctum's incense curdled into the scent of rain on ancient bones. The transformation began as heat that melted and reformed, consciousness expanding beyond the limitations of singular perspective. His flesh writhed and reshaped itself according to desires that transcended mortal understanding, bones lengthening and splitting with exquisite agony. Chitinous plates erupted through skin that had once borne the scars of conventional warfare, forming armor that was neither fully imperial nor entirely Xenos, but a horrifying synthesis bearing the aquila alongside organic ridges that pulsed with alien rhythm. 4 additional limbs burst from his torso, with wet sounds that echoed through reinforced walls, each appendage moving with the synchronized precision he had envied in enemy bioforms. His face elongated beyond human recognition, compound eyes replacing mortal vision with perception that could taste fear through air and speak in harmonics that bypassed rational thought. The medals and rank insignia of his former life sank into living chitin that grew across his chest like lacquer, each honor preserved beneath translucent plates, as if the flesh itself refused to forget the language of command. When he cried out during the metamorphoses, a choir answered, from the regiment, from the gestalt fragment, from the envious god whose name had become a taste he could not expel. Through his transformed neural pathways, the demon prince felt the minds of his subordinates like instruments awaiting orchestration. Information arrived not as words, but as hunger translated into tactical vectors. Every squad's position registered as pressure against his consciousness. Firing arcs became angles of his new spine. Munitions counts manifested as tension in additional tendons. He spoke a single word, and across the fortress every officer responded with identical syllables, as if they had never learned any other sound. I. Rising from the throne taller than he had entered, the creature that had been Thaddeus Corvin surveyed his domain with satisfaction that tasted like ashes. In the courtyard below, drill formations rippled into new perfection that took his breath with its beauty and cruelty. The Unity protocols expanded beyond their original scope as his influence spread like contagion through Vox networks and psychic channels, neural compliance becoming mandatory for all personnel. Entire regiments submitted to procedures that stripped individual will while preserving enough consciousness to worship their transformed commander, their faces reflecting the terrible peace of creatures no longer burdened by choice. Yet, even as he achieved the coordination he had desperately sought, the Demon Prince discovered the cruel irony of his ascension. The perfect unity came at the price of the very humanity that had made such perfection desirable. His soldiers moved with flawless efficiency that matched any bio-swarm, but their eyes held no spark of the courage or determination that had once defined imperial valor. They were tools now, living weapons that obeyed without question, and in their mechanical compliance, he saw reflected the hollow victory of his transformation. Neither human ambition nor alien purpose, but something caught forever between species, consciousness, and meaning. In the spaces between stars where thought became substance and desire took malevolent form, two titans of consciousness clashed with such fury that reality itself began to buckle under the strain. The Hive mind, that ancient and implacable intelligence spanning galaxies, had finally recognized the true nature of the corruption that gnawed at its perfect unity. Morghast, the envious Maw, pressed against the alien consciousness like a parasite seeking to hollow out its host, whispering promises of individual awareness within collective purpose. The psychic battle that erupted transcended physical dimension, a war fought in the realm of pure thought, where the stakes were nothing less than the nature of consciousness itself. Across the eastern fringe, the conflict manifested as reality storms that defied every law of physics the Imperium had codified in 10 millennia of expansion. On Hadrian's crown, gravity reversed itself for 17 minutes, sending entire hive spires tumbling into the void while their inhabitants screamed prayers to an emperor who seemed suddenly distant. Time fractured on a dozen worlds simultaneously. Imperial Guard regiments aged centuries in heartbeats before reverting to their original states, their minds shattered by the experience of living and dying in temporal loops. Navigator houses reported warp routes that led to destinations that had not yet been discovered, while astropaths across 3 sectors fell silent, their minds overwhelmed by the psychic backwash of titans at war. The hive mind's response was as brutal as it was necessary, a cosmic amputation performed with surgical precision that spoke to an alien understanding of sacrifice beyond human comprehension. Entire biofleets, some numbering in the millions of organisms, were severed from the collective consciousness and left to drift in the void like abandoned corpses. Synapse creatures that had served as neural relays for millennia found their connections cauterized, their purpose stripped away in moments of agony that echoed across light years. The Great Devourer was performing surgery upon itself, cutting away infected thoughts with the ruthless efficiency of a body rejecting poison, willing to sacrifice vast portions of its own consciousness rather than allow corruption to spread through its perfect form. Each psychic wound sent shockwaves through the immaterium, waves of alien suffering that crashed against human minds like tsunamis of pure thought. On Vardain Secundus, Demon Prince Corvin felt the tremors through his transformed neural pathways and understood that his patron deity faced an enemy whose commitment to purity exceeded even Chaos's capacity for destruction. Admiral Voss's Unity protocols began to falter as the psychic interference disrupted the neural compliance networks that bound his crews together, their synchronized movements becoming erratic as competing influences tore at their artificially imposed collective consciousness. In the depths of Benediction's Rest, the corrupted Genestealer cult experienced the cosmic battle as a schism in their very souls, some embracing the individual awareness that Morgus offered, while others fled desperately back toward the familiar unity of the traditional hive mind. Yet Morgus endured, its envious nature proving as persistent as entropy itself. With each rejection, each psychic counterattack, the nascent Chaos God learned and adapted, refining its approach like a virus evolving to overcome immune responses. It began to focus its efforts on the spaces between thoughts, the microsecond gaps where even the hive mind's perfect unity showed hairline fractures. The entity whispered not of rebellion against the collective, but of improvement upon it. Unity with awareness, purpose with understanding, perfection with the capacity to appreciate its own flawlessness. These were seductive lies wrapped in partial truths, and they found purchase in minds that had never been taught to recognize the poison hidden within apparent gifts. The war raged on without resolution, two incompatible forms of consciousness locked in a struggle that neither could truly win. The hive mind's absolute commitment to unity made it incorruptible, but also inflexible, while Morghast's envious nature gave it endless persistence, but no true understanding of what it sought to possess. In the spaces between their conflict, the galaxy continued its slow spiral toward entropy, scarred by a battle most would never comprehend, a war between the desire for perfection and the terrible price of achieving it, fought in dimensions where victory itself might prove indistinguishable from damnation. In the cold expanse between dying stars, Hive Fleet Morrigan writhed like a wounded god, its bioships pulsing with the erratic rhythms of consciousness at war with itself. The corruption that Morghast had seeded within the collective mind had bloomed into something unprecedented in the galaxy's blood-soaked history. Tyranids capable of philosophical disagreement. What had once been the perfect unity of the Great Devourer now fractured along lines that violated millions of years of evolutionary perfection, creating the first civil war within a species that had never known the concept of internal conflict. The synapse creature designated Shard Within felt the schism as physical agony, its consciousness stretched between competing harmonies that should never have existed within a single mind. Through compound eyes that had learned to perceive reality as a solitary entity, it watched its children divide into factions whose very existence defied natural law. The Awakened, as they had begun to call themselves in crude vocalizations that served no tactical purpose, gathered in the spawning chambers with movements that carried the weight of individual choice rather than collective imperative. These bioforms had tasted the seductive poison of self-awareness and found it more intoxicating than any prey they had ever consumed. A hive tyrant, its 6 eyes reflecting something that might have been wonder, attempted to explain concepts that had no place in the Tyranid lexicon: personal preference, individual achievement, the terrible loneliness of consciousness separated from the whole. Its words emerged as harmonics that bypassed rational thought, creating the first Tyranid philosophy born from existential need rather than instinctive hunger. Around it, Carnifex broods that had once moved with unified precision now exhibited behaviors that served no tactical function, some developing preferences for certain types of terrain, others displaying what could only be described as artistic appreciation for the patterns their claws carved through enemy formations. The Genestealer brood suffered most profoundly from the transformation, their hybrid nature making them uniquely susceptible to concepts of identity that transcended biological imperatives. These creatures formed primitive hierarchies based not on genetic purity, but on individual accomplishment, creating social structures that horrified their pure strain kin. Some had begun exhibiting mercy toward wounded prey, hesitating before delivering killing strikes as they contemplated the nature of suffering they were about to inflict. Most unnaturally, they had learned to name themselves, crude appellations that distinguished one creature from its genetic twins, in ways that made the fleet's tactical coordination stutter and fail. The Loyalist faction responded to this corruption with the ruthless efficiency that defined their species, moving through the fleet's living corridors like immune responses targeting infection. These traditional bioforms fought desperately to preserve their connection to the pure hive mind, accepting the agony of isolation as they severed links to corrupted elements. Their attacks came without warning or negotiation, surgical strikes designed to preserve the fleet's integrity by removing creatures that could no longer function as extensions of collective will. Yet even these purifiers found their certainty shaken as they witnessed the desperate innovation of their corrupted kin. Awakened creatures fighting back with strategies born from their newfound fear of extinction. The civil war that erupted within Hive Fleet Morrigan defied every tactical doctrine in Imperial records. Bioships designed for seamless coordination now fired upon each other with devastating force, their weapons guided by competing synaptic impulses. Broods of Hormagaunts, their minds torn between whispers of self and the call of the collective, would suddenly turn on their own kind, tearing apart brethren in frenzies of confused aggression. The psychic screams emanating from Morrigan were no longer the unified roar of a devouring swarm, but a discordant cacophony of agony, each shriek a testament to consciousness being violently torn asunder. Shard Within found itself caught between impossible choices as the battle raged through the fleet's biomechanical corridors. To reinforce the purge would soothe the splinter of individual thought in its skull, ending the agony of singular perception. To protect the awakened would mark it for removal as a tumor refusing the surgeon's blade. Yet, as it watched a gargoyle pause to look back at a clutchmate before diving, an act of almost love with no tactical utility, it understood that some choices transcended logic. The Synapse creature sent new vectors with authority it had never known it possessed, bending fire arcs around the awakened like a river split by stone. When the nearest Loyalist tyrant struck in response, their duel collapsed time into heartbeats, measured by impacts. The adherent moved with ancient purpose, while Shard Within answered with improvisation, using self-preservation as algorithm, retreating not to regroup, but to think, a blasphemy against momentum that ultimately proved decisive. As the schism widened into a wound that would not heal, both factions began exhibiting behaviors that transcended their original nature. The awakened rallied around leaders chosen for individual merit rather than genetic design, while Loyalists developed crude innovations born from desperation. The war became a laboratory for evolution, forcing rapid adaptation in minds never designed to change, creating new forms of consciousness that were neither purely collective nor entirely individual. In the deepest chambers, where Norn queens sang of sterility and safety, the greater hive mind made its terrible calculation. The corrupted elements could not be reclaimed, only excised. Across light years, the antibodies of pure thought began their systematic amputation, willing to sacrifice vast portions of the fleet rather than allow the infection to spread. Shard, within, felt the approaching purge like distant thunder and understood that whatever followed would kill something that could never rise again. The tragic beauty of minds learning to exist in the space between collective purpose and personal desire. Consciousness as both gift and curse. The ancient consciousness of the hive mind stretched across the void like a web of living thought, its calculations spanning millennia and countless devoured worlds. In the cold mathematics of survival, it had reached an inescapable conclusion. The infection that Morghast had seeded within its perfect unity could not be cleansed, only excised. The decision came with the ruthless efficiency of a body rejecting poison, unmarred by concepts of mercy or regret that plagued lesser intelligences. Hive Fleet Charybdis, a vast tendril of uncontaminated consciousness, shifted course from its original feeding grounds toward the Hadrian sector with new purpose. Not consumption, but purgation of elements that had dared to think for themselves. Admiral Lysander Voss felt the approaching fleet through neural pathways rewired by months of compliance protocols. His consciousness expanded beyond mortal limitations, yet trapped within the hollow perfection of artificial coordination. Standing upon the command bridge of the Emperor's Wrath, he watched tactical displays paint the sector's transformation in colors that had no names in human language. His officers moved with the synchronized precision he had once envied in enemy bioforms, their responses flowing like liquid efficiency through command hierarchies stripped of individual will. The irony burned like acid in his enhanced awareness. He had achieved the unity he craved by becoming something that was neither human nor truly alien, forging weapons in the image of their foe, only to discover that mimicry was indistinguishable from surrender. The first engagements erupted near Benediction's Rest, as pure Tyranid forces descended upon their corrupted kin with surgical brutality. These were not the chaotic feeding frenzies that marked traditional consumption, but precise operations designed to remove infection from the collective consciousness. Bioships moved with the fluid certainty that Voss's forces could only approximate through artificial means, their attacks guided by instincts refined across millions of years of evolutionary perfection. Against such purity, the hybrid consciousness of corrupted elements appeared as crude mockery, individual awareness struggling against collective imperative in ways that made both states impossible. Demon Prince Corvin surveyed the unfolding carnage from the scarred battlefields of Vardane's Secundus, his transformed senses processing the psychic cacophony that filled local space. His biomechanical form towered over formations that moved with inhuman coordination, additional limbs orchestrating maneuvers that flowed like choreographed death across ruined landscapes. The soldiers under his command fought with the synchronized efficiency of the swarms they faced, yet their eyes held the vacant certainty of creatures operating under artificial collective will rather than evolutionary design. When bioforms met bioforms in the ruins of imperial cities, the distinction between loyalist and xenos became meaningless. Only the method of corruption differed. Through channels that burned like molten metal in his transformed neural pathways, Corvin felt the approach of something vast and implacably pure. The greater hive mind pressed against the sector's boundaries with the weight of collapsing stars, its consciousness untainted by the envious whispers that had seduced lesser intelligences. This was judgment incarnate, the alien equivalent of the Emperor's wrath made manifest through creatures that had never learned compromise or negotiation. The demon prince understood with crystalline clarity that his patron deity's greatest victory had become its ultimate trap. By mimicking Tyranid perfection, they had marked themselves for the same purification protocols the swarm applied to its own corrupted elements. The three-way battle that erupted across multiple star systems defied every tactical doctrine recorded in Imperial archives. Pure Tyranid forces engaged their corrupted kin with movements that carried the weight of absolute certainty, while Imperial fleets found themselves caught between evolutionary perfection and artificial unity. Voss's ships moved through space with coordinated precision that should have been impossible for human forces to execute, firing patterns synchronized to microsecond intervals that created overlapping fields of destruction. Yet the enemy they faced had anticipated such strategies, the pure hive mind calculating responses to its own corrupted tactics with the cold efficiency of a master strategist facing a distorted mirror. The psychic emanations from the conflict tore through local space like tsunamis of pure thought, reality storms that caught imperial worlds in their wake and twisted them into impossible geometries. On Hadrian's crown, gravity reversed itself in localized pockets, where competing influences created interference patterns in the fabric of space-time. Entire populations found themselves aging decades in moments before reverting to their original states, their minds shattered by experiences of living and dying in temporal loops that violated every law of physics the Mechanicus had codified. Through it all, Morgus fed on the growing desperation of forces caught between incompatible forms of perfection. The nascent chaos. God drew strength from the envy that drove imperial commanders to mimic their enemies' coordination, growing more powerful with each order that expanded unity protocols throughout the sector's remaining fleets. Yet, even as it gorged on psychic emanations from the three-way war, the entity began to understand the cruel irony of its own existence. By achieving the unity it craved, it had marked its servants for destruction by the very consciousness it sought to possess. The purge continued with mechanical precision as Charybdis systematically eliminated corrupted elements from Hive Fleet Morrigan. Bioships designed for seamless coordination now fired upon each other with devastating force, their weapons guided by competing synaptic impulses that created cascading failures throughout the infected fleet. The Awakened fought back with desperate innovation born from their newfound fear of extinction. But individuals' consciousness proved no match for the collective efficiency that had conquered galaxies. In the spaces between these conflicts, reality itself became a battlefield where the nature of consciousness was tested against the anvil of absolute war. The psychic epicenter above Benediction's Rest pulsed like a malignant heart, reality itself warping around the convergence of incompatible consciousnesses that pressed against the fabric of space-time with the weight of collapsing stars. In the immaterial realm, where thought became substance and desire took malevolent form, Morgus made its final, desperate gambit against the ancient intelligence of the hive mind. The nascent chaos. God's envious essence coiled through dimensions that mortal minds could not comprehend, seeking not to destroy the alien perfection it craved, but to hollow it out and wear its skin like a crown of stolen unity. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex stood in the sanctum of her strike cruiser Veritas Mortis, her weathered hands resting upon the containment field that housed her greatest heresy, the Severant Lattice, an archaeotech relic from the dark age of technology that hummed with frequencies that made reality itself recoil. 4 decades of service to the Golden Throne had led her to this moment of terrible clarity, the understanding that some sacrifices transcended personal survival or orthodox doctrine. The device required a willing consciousness to serve as anchor, a mind burned away to fuel mechanisms that would sever the psychic connections binding Morgus to its coveted prize. Through the reinforced armor glass of her observation dome, she watched the Hadrian sector transform into a battlefield where the fundamental nature of consciousness itself was being tested against the anvil of absolute war. Tekmagos Zephyr Null moved through the ship's corridors with movements that carried the fluid grace of creatures caught between species. Her form now a disturbing synthesis of augmetic limbs and chitinous plates that pulsed with alien rhythms. The corruption that had claimed her had also granted terrible insights into the architecture of collective consciousness, knowledge that made her both invaluable and damned. Her mechadendrites interfaced with the lattice's control systems, equations flowing across her optical displays as she calculated the precise harmonics needed to tear apart a god's throat. The resonance must be perfect, she intoned through vox grills that carried harmonics no human throat should produce. Imprecision will amplify rather than sever, feeding the very entity we seek to starve. Admiral Lysander Voss felt the neural compliance networks that bound his crews together beginning to fracture under the psychic pressure emanating from the convergence point. Standing on the command bridge of the Emperor's Wrath, he watched his officers struggle with the return of individual thought, their synchronized movements becoming erratic as competing influences tore at their artificially imposed collective consciousness. The terrible irony burned like acid in his enhanced awareness. In seeking to preserve humanity through mimicry of alien perfection, he had stripped away everything that made them human, creating weapons that were neither imperial valor nor Xenos efficiency, but something caught forever between purpose and meaning. Through tactical displays that painted the sector's transformation in colors that had no names in human language, he witnessed the systematic purge of corrupted elements by pure Tyranid forces, each engagement revealing the hollow nature of his achievement. On the scarred battlefields of Vardain Secundus, Demon Prince Corvin orchestrated the movements of regiments that flowed like liquid death across ruined landscapes, his transformed consciousness processing data streams through neural pathways that screamed with alien harmonics. His biomechanical form towered over formations that moved with inhuman coordination, additional limbs conducting maneuvers with the synchronized precision he had craved since witnessing the Tyranid assault on Zirion's edge. Yet even as his forces achieved the unity he had sacrificed his humanity to obtain, the Demon Prince understood the cruel trap that Morghast had woven around them all. Through channels that burned like molten metal in his transformed awareness, he felt the approach of Hive Fleet Charybdis, pure, untainted consciousness that moved with the implacable certainty of evolutionary perfection. By becoming what they fought, they had marked themselves for the same purification protocols the hive mind applied to its own corrupted elements. The convergence accelerated as reality storms tore through local space, temporal anomalies erupting where competing forms of unity clashed with such force that the laws of physics themselves began to buckle and warp. Astropaths across 3 sectors fell silent, their minds overwhelmed by the psychic backwash of titans at war, while entire populations found themselves aging decades in moments before reverting to their original states. In the deepest chambers of the corrupted Genestealer cult, Patriarch Zerion felt his children tear themselves apart, as the choice they had never been bred to make split their consciousness between traditional collective purpose and the seductive whisper of individual awareness. Vex sealed her thoughts behind Iron Litany as she prepared to activate the lattice, understanding that her consciousness would serve as fuel for mechanisms designed to create silence in the space between thoughts. The device's crystal matrices began to resonate with frequencies that made stone remember the sea and bleed for her, each harmonic a prayer written in the language of severance. Through the ship's vox systems, she heard Zephyr Null's final calculations, equations that mapped the architecture of a god's envious hunger with mathematical precision that bordered on devotional madness. As the Veritas, Mortis plunged toward the psychic epicenter, Morghast pressed its influence against her mind with seductive promises of unity without loneliness, purpose without doubt, perfection without the burden of choice that made human existence both precious and agonizing. The entity showed her visions of consciousness multiplied without dilution, a chorus of selves that would never be alone again. Yet Vex held fast to the terrible freedom of individual thought, the chaotic inefficiency that made humanity worth preserving even as it made them vulnerable to corruption. The final moment crystallized before her like frost on glass, as competing consciousnesses converged on the epicenter where reality itself became a laboratory for testing the nature of existence. With steady hands that betrayed none of the terror in her heart, Inquisitor Cassandra Vex placed the Severant Lattice against her temples and spoke the activation phrase that would either save the sector or damn it entirely. Her last words as an individual consciousness lost in the cosmic scream that followed. The activation of the Severant Lattice sent shockwaves through dimensions that mortal minds were never meant to perceive, its crystalline matrices resonating with frequencies that made reality itself recoil in horror. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex felt her consciousness expand beyond the limitations of flesh as the Archaeotech relic consumed her mind like sacred fuel, each thought burning away to power mechanisms that reached into the immaterium where gods dwelt and sanity died. The device's ancient circuitry, forged in the Dark Age of technology when humanity dared to challenge the fundamental laws of existence, carved through psychic space with surgical precision, seeking the envious thread that bound Morghast to its coveted prize. Through neural pathways that screamed with alien harmonics, Vex experienced the terrible weight of the nascent Chaos God's hunger, feeling its desperate attempts to possess the hive mind's perfect unity while retaining the individual consciousness that made such desire possible. The contradiction was the trap, and she was the key that would either lock or break it. Her sacrifice erupted across the sector as a psychic scream that shattered astropaths and made navigator houses weep blood. Reality storms cascading through local space as competing forms of consciousness clashed with such force that time itself began to fracture and bend. Tekmagos. Zephyr Null watched the energy readings spike beyond her instrument's capacity to measure, her augmetic eyes dilating as optical sensors recorded data streams that violated every principle of physics the Mechanicus had codified. Her hybrid form caught between flesh and steel, organic neural tissue and blessed machinery, pulsed with the alien rhythms that had corrupted her even as her training held firm through sheer force of will. She felt Vex's mind burn in the controlled immolation of engineered sacrifice, a conscious act of self-annihilation that transformed individual awareness into a weapon capable of severing gods. The backlash tore through the Veritas Mortis like a hurricane of pure thought, bulkheads screaming as psychic pressure exceeded their structural limits. Admiral Lysander Voss felt the universe catch its breath as the lattice's activation rippled through dimensions, the neural compliance networks that bound his crews together collapsing like cards in a psychic hurricane. Standing on the command bridge of the Emperor's Wrath, he watched officers stumble as individual consciousness flooded back with violent force, their synchronized movements dissolving into the chaotic inefficiency of personal thought and fear. The terrible irony burned like acid in his enhanced awareness. In seeking to preserve humanity through mimicry of alien perfection, he had stripped away everything that made them human, creating weapons that were neither imperial valor nor Xeno's efficiency, but hollow mockeries caught between meaning and purpose. through tactical displays that painted the sector's transformation in colors that had no names in human language, Voss witnessed the systematic approach of Hive Fleet Charybdis, pure bioforms moving with the implacable certainty of evolutionary perfection. These creatures had never been touched by the envious whispers that corrupted their kin, their consciousness unmarred by the poison of individual thought that made unity a choice rather than an inevitability. The ancient intelligence of the hive mind recognized no distinction between artificial unity and alien corruption. Both violated the purity of collective purpose and would be purged with equal ruthlessness. On the scarred battlefields of Vardain Secundus, Demon Prince Corvin felt Morghast's anguish through neural pathways that burned like molten metal, his transformed consciousness processing the entity's desperate attempts to maintain its hold on the coveted perfection. The biomechanical form that housed his awareness towered over formations that continued their synchronized maneuvers with inhuman precision. Yet their movements now carried the hollow certainty of creatures operating under artificial collective will, rather than evolutionary design. The severance cut through him like a blade drawn across exposed nerves, leaving him isolated in ways his human mind had never been equipped to comprehend. The psychic wound that Vex's sacrifice carved through the immaterium manifested as reality storms across multiple star systems, temporal anomalies erupting where competing forms of consciousness had clashed with cosmic force. On Hadrian's crown, entire populations aged centuries in heartbeats before reverting to their original states, their minds shattered by experiences of living and dying in loops that violated causality itself. Astropaths throughout the sector fell silent, their consciousness overwhelmed by the backwash of titans at war, while space itself twisted into impossible geometries that made stone remember the sea and weep for forgotten shores. Morghast's scream echoed through dimensions as its envious essence was torn away from the alien perfection it had sought to possess. The nascent chaos. God's desperate attempts to hollow out the hive mind collapsing under the weight of Vex's burning consciousness. The ancient intelligence of the great devourer responded to liberation with cold efficiency, its antibodies of pure thought lashing out against the retreating corruption with surgical precision that spoke to an understanding of unity beyond mortal comprehension. The entity that had fed on envy found itself starved, its connection to the coveted prize severed by mechanisms designed to create silence in the space between thoughts. Admiral Voss made his choice as the pure hive mind's influence spread through the sector, like antibodies cleansing infection from a wounded body. With hands that trembled from the return of individual will, he opened channels to his scattered fleet, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had glimpsed perfection and found it wanting. All ships, new target designation, Demon Prince Corvin's position on Vardain Secundus. Full broadsides authorized. We end what we began. The order rippled through command networks no longer bound by artificial unity, each captain making the choice to follow based on personal conscience rather than imposed coordination. The orbital bombardment that followed was humanity's final judgment upon the mockery they had created. Lance strikes and macro-cannon barrages turning the scarred surface of Vardain Secundus into a searing inferno that consumed the hollow unity Corvin had sacrificed his soul to achieve. The silence that descended upon the eastern fringe carried the weight of cosmic amputation, reality itself bearing scars where incompatible forms of consciousness had clashed with such fury that space-time retained their imprint like keloid tissue in the fabric of existence. In the aftermath of warfare that transcended physical dimension, the Hadrian sector drifted through the void as a monument to the price of envying perfection, its worlds twisted by temporal storms and psychic backlash that would echo through millennia yet to come. Morghast endured in the deepest reaches of the immaterium, wounded but not destroyed, for such entities rarely perish in any sense that mortal minds could comprehend. The envious maw had withdrawn into dormancy, its essence coiled like a serpent nursing grievous wounds. Starved of the unity it had craved, yet patient as entropy itself. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex's sacrifice had achieved its terrible purpose. The severance was complete, the nascent chaos, God's connection to the hive mind, severed by mechanisms that transformed individual consciousness into a weapon capable of cutting gods. Yet in the spaces between thoughts, the entity whispered still to minds desperate enough to listen, promising salvation through conscious unity while concealing the price of such gifts behind seductive harmonies that tasted like metal and felt like amputation from the divine collective. The hive mind emerged from the conflict forever altered, its ancient intelligence bearing microscopic changes that would ripple through eons like stones cast into still water. Where once it had moved with the absolute certainty of evolutionary perfection, now it carried within its vast consciousness the smallest seed of caution, a hesitation measured in nanoseconds that spoke to hard-won wisdom about the nature of corruption. The entity that had devoured galaxies with mechanical efficiency now understood that even the most alien consciousness could be touched by the chaos dwelling in the spaces between unified thought. Its bioforms moved with coordination, still flawless, yet tempered by awareness that perfection itself could become vulnerability. Each tactical calculation now filtered through knowledge that purity was not invincible. Admiral Lysander Voss stood in the observation deck of the Emperor's Wrath, watching recovery fleets move through debris fields that sparkled with the remains of 3 different forms of perfection. The neural compliance networks lay shattered, their destruction witnessed by officers who wept to remember what they had willingly surrendered in the name of efficiency. His crews worked with the chaotic inefficiency of individual thought restored, their movements lacking synchronized precision, yet carrying something more precious, the spark of human determination that made each choice meaningful rather than inevitable. Through reinforced armor glass, Voss saw his reflection age decades by decisions that could never be unmade, yet his eyes held clarity that no artificial coordination could provide. The orbital bombardment of Vardain Secundus had left nothing but cooling glass, where Demon Prince Corvin's forces had achieved their hollow unity. The creature that had once been Lord General Thaddeus Corvin was gone, his biomechanical form consumed in searing inferno that turned continental plates to molten scars. Yet even in death, his influence lingered in psychic residue that clung to the world's surface like radiation, a reminder of the price paid for perfection achieved through artificial means. When Voss descended to witness what his orders had wrought, he found only suggestions in the glass, shadows where heat had folded men and monsters into anonymous curves, and at the crater's edge, a rank sigil preserved like an insect in amber. The aquila warped beneath blackened chitin that spoke of unity without meaning. Tech Magos. Zephyr Null's fate remained shrouded in the psychic storms that had torn through the Veritas Mortis. Her laboratories stood sealed and sanctified, research notes encrypted beyond recovery, and hybrid creations reduced to blessed ash. The Mechanicus declared her work anathema, yet scholars would debate for centuries whether her blasphemies had revealed fundamental truths about consciousness or merely proven that some questions were too dangerous to ask. In the deepest archives, her final transmission survived as corrupted symbols that reformed into a single, readable sentence before self-immolation. The instrument served, the envy sleeps, do not wake it by imitation. On Benediction's rest, surviving members of the corrupted Genestila cult wandered through empty catacombs like ghosts seeking absolution for sins they could not name. Patriarch Zerion had not survived the psychic backlash, his ancient form crumbling as competing forms of consciousness tore his mind apart. Those who remained found themselves caught between states of being, no longer connected to the approaching Hive fleet, yet unable to embrace individual awareness that had cost them everything. They spoke in whispers of the four-armed emperor who would never come, their faith transformed into hybrid theology born from the ashes of shattered unity. The remnants of Hive Fleet Morrigan drifted through the void as monuments to consciousness corrupted, their bioships dark and silent as tombs. The purge had been absolute, pure Tyranid forces, eliminating every trace of individual awareness with surgical precision that left no room for mercy. Yet even in death, these creatures had achieved something unprecedented. They had thought for themselves, experienced the terrible freedom of choice, and died defending ideas that had no basis in genetic programming. Their sacrifice would be forgotten by history, recorded only in psychic echoes that haunted local space. In the depths where the cosmic battle had raged most fiercely, reality bore permanent scars. Regions where warp currents flowed in patterns that defied comprehension, creating routes to destinations existing only in the spaces between thoughts. These anomalies would persist for millennia, monuments to conflict most would never understand, a war between the desire for perfection and the terrible price of achieving it. The galaxy continued its spiral toward entropy, scarred yet somehow enriched by knowledge that even alien consciousness could be touched by chaos itself. The greatest victory belonged neither to order nor corruption, but to the chaotic inefficiency of individual thought that made every choice sacred and every sacrifice meaningful.